Welcome back. This is recording number 2 of Chapter 8 from Larson's. So now we continue our journey through constraints, rescheduling, resources and costs, and we now explore in a little more detail resource-constrained projects and some of the issues around that. We know that resources are limited in the quantity or availability. The key issue could be how much and when can you get it. Activities can be scheduled using heuristics or rules of thumb. And rules of thumb are basically your accumulated knowledge of how things work. And this can be intellectual property of the organisation, or it can be to do with the activities, or it can be to do with particular skills that people might bring on the project team. And these heuristics focus on minimum slack, smallest or least duration for the activities, and the lowest identification number. So this is how you schedule activities using heuristics. And as you can see, it's a way of also moving the risk of the projects around as well. And the parallel method is used to apply a heuristics, which is an iterative, that is, repeats itself process, which starts at the first time period of the project and scheduling then period by period the start of any activities using those 3 priority rules. So just think about the 3 priority rules: slack, duration, minimum identification, lowest ID number, which means it's towards the beginning. And then the parallel process is iterative, and it starts at the first time period and then scheduling period by period. Just get to the next slide. So there's an example in the text, which is fairly complicated, lots of detail, it's worth looking through, which is developing a handheld electronic medical reference guide. And it's to be used by technicians and paramedics. The problem is there's only 8 design engineers who can be assigned to the project due to a shortage of design engineers and also commitments to other projects. So it's similar to the examples we've used in the first recording with programmers. Once again, it's about moving them around and reprioritizing the activities that they're undertaking. So I'll leave you to have a look at that. It's quite interesting, and there's some nice worked examples there. So what are some of the impacts then of resource-constrained scheduling? We know that every project we're working on invariably has resource constraints. And what it does, where you have that, it reduces delay, but reduces flexibility. So there's the trade-off again, time and flexibility. But you might decide that flexibility is not a major priority for you, but time is. On the other hand, you may have a lot more time, but you have no flexibility. This might depend on what the type of project is, to what degree are there technical specifications embedded in the project which you can't change. But what this will do, it will increase the criticality of events. So all of a sudden, everything becomes more important because there's less resources, greater risk, there's less time, less slack. It increases the scheduling complexity then. So as you start to take resources out or have constraints, the degree of flexibility is reduced and the complexity can increase, and it might make the critical path no longer meaningful because you simply had to change things around so much that you can't rely on the critical path to get you through to the end of the project. You may have to break the sequence of events because of resource availability, and it may cause parallel activities to become sequentials and critical activities with slack to become non-critical. So this, you begin to think this is a fairly significant rethinking of the project assumptions, constraints, and this really will require maybe a reworking of your project plan and resource allocation. Now, why might this happen? Well, the project might be started in a time period when there are adequate resources, but then, as we know, the environment changes and suddenly there are less resources available, or there are other priorities for the organisation that's running the projects, particularly if it's running multiple projects. You might start to look at splitting some of your activities. What you then is, in splitting, as I said, is essentially used to get project schedule and increase resource utilisation. And that is where you interrupt work on an activity and then take the resources somewhere else and then return the resource later to finish it. Now, that's once again fairly intuitive. And if you've got six patients to be looked after and 2 nurses, you might start one task with 1 patient with 2 nurses, and you stop them, move them to the next one. You might split the nursing team into 2 and then start allocating your staff around again. It could be nurses looking after patients. It could be engineers looking after a project. It could be people in the kitchen cooking food. Same thing. It's feasible when your startup and shutdown costs are low. But if you have to reprogram equipment, reorientate staff, certify them as with degrees of some type of competence or certification, it becomes a real issue. And it's often the reason why projects fail to meet schedule, because the resources are split in such a way that you are losing more productivity in the startup and shutdown times than you are gaining in terms of resource allocation. And the example here might be, you've got activity duration without splitting. That's the top white square. But then you might split it into 3 segments. Now, this is okay, providing activity A doesn't have a shutdown period. So if you're using equipment or some form of technology where there has to be a staged shutdown, and then activity B has a startup, the question is, can you shut down activity A and start up activity B at the same time? Or does one have to follow on the other? And then same for activity B and then activity C. So really what you've done, whilst you might have reallocated the resources, you have increased the total time taken. And now, of course, there's the other impact that this will have on the project team. They will say, look, we keep getting diverted from one task to the other. It might take a day to get up to speed on this task. We can't just suddenly chop and change. And they're issues that you need to negotiate at the project team level. The benefits of scheduling resources, of course, you can work out what you've got. It leaves time for consideration of alternatives such as cost and time trade-offs or changes in priorities. And this goes, I guess, to the heart of some of the socio-cultural or soft skill aspects of project management. Making the trade-off, looking at reasonable alternatives. And this depends on the degree to which a strategic focus on the project looks at reasonable alternatives or has an imperative to have the project finished at a particular time. And they're sort of higher order strategic decisions that need to be made. The other benefits of scheduling resources are it provides information for your time-phased work package budgets, because then you can then assess any unforeseen events and you might be able to look at moving resources around. Having a plan and a schedule, understanding where everything is, understanding your constraints, being able to make trade-offs, look at the priorities and rework them means that you're probably getting much more effective use out of your resources. Now, this becomes increasingly complex, of course, as you end up with more projects in your portfolio. So managing multiple project scheduling, like it's happening with the major capital works happening in Sydney at the moment, where we're building all these motorways everywhere. You've got project officers on each site, and then they have to, then there's a project office or project officer or project management function, which is overseeing the resource utilisation across all the different projects. And they may be using a priority queuing system. It might be chronological. The first people who arrive with a resource request get it. Or there may be some other way of allocating resources, indicating, for example, allocating resources, extra resources to project A may mean that it finishes in such a way that project B can't start. Project B can't start, say, for 10 days after project A finishes. Or the point I'm making is that moving resources around multiple projects will start to change how the projects then interrelate. I probably wasn't all that clear in my explanation there, but I'm sure you get what I mean. You might want to centralize project management and treat all projects as part of a mega project, particularly if you're in an organization which is running multiple projects. It's always good to be able to stand back and say, what's the total project activity in this organisation, the impacts having, which projects are causing the greatest disruption and which projects are running the best, etc. You may want to outsource some of these projects so that you've got more time to handle projects of more risk and more consequence internally. That again is a strategic decision you might make. Multi-projects, of course, have problems though. You have increased complexity, multiple timelines, multiple communication patterns, and the fact that the projects, as I tried to explain not very well in my previous comment, delay in one project might create delays in other projects, and this can have a snowballing effect or a multiplying effect down the projects. You may have inefficient resource application, and you get peaks and troughs of resource demands, starts to create an amplitude of resource variability, which will have an impact throughout the organisation, and you may end up with resource bottlenecks, which is where you get shortages of critical resources that are required for multiple projects. And if they're all required at the one time, then you have real issues then with delay. And the challenge then is to make sure that critical points in the project are noted, and where you've got multiple projects, that they don't all occur at the same time. You then go on and look at the project cost baseline. Now, once resource assignments are completed, you can then start to develop a budget. So once you know everything you've got to do, got the work breakdown structure, sorted out priorities, worked out how you might be able to reschedule things, time for a budget. And you use the project schedule, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. You then time phase work packages. Work package A, B, and C happen on day 1, D, E, and F happen on day 2, etc. You can then start to build a bottom-up budget. And they're really important because they then will drive your information system. Because when you're looking at your project information system, you look to the completion of tasks off your activity diagram. You also look to your expenditure of costs from your budget. And then you use the information from the work breakdown structure and the resource schedule to create a time-phased budget baseline, and which defines work, identifies the time to complete, puts a budget on it, what are the resources needed, who is responsible for it, and when are these things measured. This is fairly straightforward planning, basically. What needs to be done? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? How much resources are needed? People, time, all that sort of stuff. Who is responsible? So then who has carriage of accountability for this? And then how do we review it at milestone points? So some key terms, we start to draw to a conclusion here. Some key terms here are the term heuristics, rule of thumb, pre-existing knowledge. Leveling, which is delaying non-critical activities using positive slack. We love positive slack to reduce peak demand and fill in the valleys or the troughs for resources. Because in projects, what we like is undulation. We don't like amplitude, big amplitude, because that means you have to expend resources in managing the amplitude in the differences in the resource needs. We look at the planned value, and we start to look at that in some of the later chapters. How much should have been completed by this point in time? How much has been completed? What is the relationship between the two of them? In a resource-constrained project, you assume that the level of resources are not able to be exceeded. If you've got 20 units available, then you can't use more than 20 units. So that way, it's really important to know when those units need to be used. And if your project is time constrained, it must be finished by an imposed date. And I think probably most of us are used to working with time constrained projects, particularly in public buildings and that sort of area, or in technology. We use the term resource smoothing, which is the process of evening out resource demand by delaying non-critical activities using Slack, which to lower peak demand and thus increasing resource utilization. So as I was saying, what we're doing is where you look at resources as a graph or a wave, we reduce the amplitude and smooth out the peaks and troughs, which makes for more consistent forecasting, easier purchasing, more control management of your supply chains, for example, of people and materials. You may want to split activities to get better schedule and resource utilization by splitting continuous work and reallocating resources to other activities. But you know, of course, that will have, it could be a downside in terms of, close down and start up of these activities, or even just the time constraints of moving staff around, or the lack of productivity from moving people around. So there will be a trade-off here. And you have a time-phased budget, which is the process of allocating time over budgets to get much better accurate interpretation of milestones and in particular budget reports. And that pretty much, I think, brings us to the end here. We have some discussion questions which we'll look at in class.